My daughter hugged me at her wedding and whispered, "Dad, do you remember what you did?" What she showed me stopped my breath. Before we get started, like this video and share with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. Now let's get right into it. I never imagined my daughter's wedding would feel like walking into enemy territory. The air was heavy before I even stepped through the grand hotel doors, like the building itself knew I didn't belong. Laughter spilled from the banquet hall, muffled by thick walls, but it didn't soften. It cut, the same way laughter always had when it wasn't meant for me. My shoes sounded too loud on the marble floor. Polished, perfect, echoing. I hated that sound. The sound of a man trying to stand tall when every pair of eyes was waiting to measure how far he'd fall. A greeter glanced at the invitation in my hand, smiled too quickly, and pointed me toward the hall. Her eyes flicked once, just once, as if she recognized my name. Or maybe I only imagined it. I've been imagining judgment for so long that sometimes I think I see it in every stranger's glance. The doors opened. Light and music rushed out at me like a tidal wave. Flowers everywhere, a string quartet off to the side, crystal chandeliers bathing everyone in gold. Money poured into every corner of the room. Money I once knew how to make. Money that had been ripped from me the same way everything else was. And there they were. My ex-wife, seated at the front, draped in silk and satisfaction. Her smile didn't falter when her eyes met mine. If anything, it sharpened. It was the smile of someone who believed she'd won. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to keep walking. Not for her. Not for the whispers I could already hear rising at the edges of the crowd. For my daughter. For the little girl who used to cling to my leg and beg me to spin her around the living room. For the child who once told me I was her hero before the world taught her otherwise. She stood at the end of the aisle, radiant in white. She looked older than I remembered, more distant, but when her eyes found mine, something flickered there. Something I couldn't name yet. The ceremony blurred. The pastor's words, the vows, the laughter when someone fumbled a line, all of it washed over me without sticking. My heart beat so hard I could barely hear. And then, at last, the moment came. She stepped toward me, veil lifted, eyes glistening. She leaned in, arms circling me. A hug, polite enough for the crowd, formal enough to hide behind. But her lips brushed my ear, and her whisper sliced deeper than any knife. "Dad, do you remember what you did?" My stomach lurched. Her words weren't a question. They were an accusation, a trigger, a key turned in a lock I'd kept bolted for years. Before I could form a reply, I felt something press into my palm. A folded piece of paper, small enough to pass unnoticed. She pulled back, her smile bright for the cameras, her eyes unreadable. Applause erupted around us. Cameras flashed. I clapped when everyone else did, but inside, I was frozen. My fingers clenched around that note like it was the only solid thing in the room. I didn't open it. Not yet. I couldn't. Instead, I let myself be carried through the motions. The processional, the endless congratulations, the polite nods from people who used to call me friend and now looked at me like a ghost that refused to stay buried. Finally, when I found a sliver of solitude near the back of the hall, I slipped the note open beneath the table. For words that made my vision blur and my breath stutter. I know the truth. The note wouldn't leave my hand. Even when I folded it, even when I tucked it into the inner pocket of my jacket, I could still feel it there like a shard of glass pressing against my ribs. I know the truth. Truth. What truth? I'd lived under so many versions of the truth, rewritten by so many different mouths, that sometimes even I couldn't remember which pieces were real. My ex-wife had her truth. My brothers-in-law had theirs. My former colleagues, they were the loudest, always making sure their truth drowned out mine. And my daughter, my sweet, beautiful girl, she had grown up on a diet of their poison. I thought I had lost her completely. So why now? Why here, on the day she bound her life to another family? Would she tell me she knew? The dinner began, but I barely tasted anything. Plates of roasted lamb, clinking glasses, speeches filled with laughter. Around me, conversations blurred into one another, the words tangling into a low hum. It was my ex-wife's toast that dragged me back. She rose with her champagne flute, her posture regal, her smile deliberate. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she said, eyes sweeping the room before landing squarely on me. Family means everything. And though the past wasn't always easy, Today proves that love and perseverance can overcome, well, anything. The room chuckled politely. I didn't. I knew who her words were aimed at. Every syllable was a dagger dipped in honey. I stared at the tablecloth, tracing patterns with my eyes, but the memories pushed through anyway. It was 5 years ago, a Sunday dinner. I had been invited, or rather, summoned, to my in-laws' house. Back then, I was still clawing at the edges of my ruined career, trying to explain, trying to prove I hadn't done what they said I had. The SEC investigation had just gutted me. 20 years of spotless accounting work, shredded overnight. Someone had funneled false numbers into reports with my signature. Forgery, plain and simple. But nobody wanted to hear that. My wife, then still my wife, had sat across the table, arms folded. Her father at the head, my daughter quiet beside her. And then the question started. How could you be so careless? Do you know what you've done to our name? Tell me, Richard, was it greed? Or stupidity? I tried to answer, I really did. But every word out of my mouth was met with scoffs, with interruptions, with that awful sound of people laughing at you while pretending they're not. And then my wife delivered the line that still burned in my skull. You'll never be trusted with anything important again. My daughter giggled, not cruelly, but because everyone else was laughing. She was only 15. What could she know? Still, it cut me deeper than anything. Back in the wedding hall, my fork trembled in my hand. I set it down before anyone noticed. My ex-wife's toast ended to applause, and I forced myself to raise my glass like everyone else. But the memories wouldn't stop. The morning they came for me, I thought it was a mistake. 2 men in suits, badges, clipped voices. The SEC wanted to discuss discrepancies. I walked into that office like a man walking into a storm he doesn't believe will actually hit. My boss, the man I had worked beside for 2 decades, barely looked me in the eye. He slid a file across the desk. My name, my signature, numbers I had never approved. This came from your terminal, Richard, he said. I remember my confusion turning to rage, then panic. They didn't care about my explanations. The evidence was clear, and the more I protested, the more guilty I sounded. By the end of the day, my career was over. By the end of the week, so was my marriage. I blinked back into the present as the best man's speech started. The room laughed at some joke I didn't catch. My daughter's new husband draped an arm around her shoulders, beaming. She glanced at me then, just for a second. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes said something else. Something like patience. My hand brushed against the note in my jacket again. My heart pounded with a thought I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe someone finally sees the truth. The reception blurred around me. Clinking glasses, polished laughter, camera flashes like fireworks. All of it distant, muffled. My mind was caught in the grip of that note. I know the truth. I must have read it 100 times in my head without ever pulling it out again. It was safer hidden, close to my chest, away from prying eyes. Safer, and yet more dangerous, because every time I repeated the words, they grew heavier. At some point, I slipped out. Nobody noticed. Why would they? My absence was a relief to most of them. The disgraced man, the stain at the edges of the family portrait. If anyone saw me leave, they probably sighed with gratitude. I found myself in a corridor, dim and hushed, far from the music. The air smelled faintly of polish and old carpets. My pulse was a hammer in my throat. And then I heard footsteps. Light ones. Familiar ones. Dad, she whispered. I turned. There she was, my daughter, still in her gown, veil tucked back, cheeks flushed with the warmth of too many congratulations. But her eyes were sharp, urgent, nothing like the softness she showed the crowd. We don't have long, she said. Her words struck me with the force of something rehearsed. Planned. What truth? My voice cracked. My mouth felt dry as ash. What do you mean? She glanced over her shoulder, then pressed a small flash drive into my hand. Silver. Ordinary. The kind of thing you could mistake for nothing. I found it while planning the wedding, she said. Buried in Mom's files. I copied everything. Her voice trembled, but her grip was steady when she closed my fingers around the drive. Everything they did to you. I stared at her. My knees almost buckled. I whispered. Her eyes glistened. It wasn't an accident, Dad. You didn't screw up. They made it look like you did. Mom. Uncle Paul. And, she hesitated, her throat tightening, his family. She didn't need to say who his was. My new son-in-law. His family, sitting proud and wealthy in that reception hall, smiling as though they owned the world. The ground shifted beneath me. For years, I had carried the shame like a coffin on my back. I had believed my wife's accusations, my colleagues' betrayal, the cruel laughter at those dinners. And now, here, on my daughter's wedding day, the coffin cracked open. The corpse wasn't mine after all. I don't understand, I said, but the truth was I did. I understood too well. I just couldn't believe it. They needed someone to take the fall, she said. You were perfect, trusted, visible, replaceable. The words hit me like stones. I staggered to a nearby chair and sat. My chest heaved, and for a moment I thought I might collapse entirely. She crouched beside me, clutching my arm. I was so angry with you, she whispered, her voice breaking. For years, I thought you ruined everything. I hated you. And all that time, she pressed her lips together, forcing back tears. All that time, they were lying. I cupped her face with a trembling hand. She let me. For the first time in years, she let me. They can't win, Dad, she said. Not anymore. Her words lit something inside me I thought was long dead. A spark. A flame that had been smothered under layers of humiliation and silence. The music swelled faintly from the hall, muffled by the walls, but I barely heard it. All I heard was her voice. All I felt was the weight of that drive in my palm. For the first time in years, the shame shifted. It wasn't mine anymore. And for the first time in years, I knew what came next. Not forgiveness. Not peace. Revenge. The flash drive sat in my jacket pocket like a second heartbeat. Even back inside the reception, with waiters weaving through tables and music swelling around me, I couldn't stop touching it. My fingers brushed against the outline again and again, as though to reassure myself it was still there, still real. I should have been smiling, toasting, playing the role of the proud father. Instead, every word of polite conversation around me felt like static. My mind was elsewhere, sifting through years of humiliation, re-examining each moment under a new light. They had done this to me. Not fate, not chance. Them. And now I finally had proof. That night, long after the last glass was emptied and the hall swept clean, I sat alone at my kitchen table with only the glow of my laptop for company. The flash drive clicked into place. My breath caught. Files opened. Folders upon folders, scanned documents, emails, spreadsheets. At first glance, it looked like chaos. But chaos has a pattern if you stare long enough. My daughter had been right. These weren't scraps. They were threads. And threads, when pulled, unravel everything. I read until dawn. Contracts signed with forged initials. Payments routed through shell companies. My name stamped again and again in places I had never touched. And emails. God, the emails. My wife's brother corresponding with my boss at the firm. Discussions about timing, about positioning Richard as the fall guy. Even one from my wife herself, cold and calculated. If this works, we won't have to worry about him standing in the way anymore. I stared at those words until they blurred. Then I laughed. A hollow, cracked laugh that startled me in the silence of my kitchen. For years I had thought myself insane, the lone man screaming against the world's judgment. And all along, the noose had been tied by the very people who smiled across dinner tables at me. A week later, my daughter met me at a small cafe far from the city center. She wore sunglasses, hair pulled back, trying not to draw attention. She looked like a child playing spy, but the determination in her eyes was real. Did you see it all? She asked, sliding into the booth. I saw enough, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. More than enough. She hesitated. I don't know how deep it goes, Dad. I found what I could, but there might be more. She swallowed. His family is connected. My husband's. The word husband hung between us like smoke. I hated it. I hated that she was tied to them now, bound by vows and signatures, the same way I had once been bound to her mother. We'll find it, I told her. We. Her voice cracked, hopeful. Yes. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. If you're brave enough to bring me this, then I'm strong enough to finish it. She nodded, tears threatening at the edges of her eyes. And in that moment, I realized, revenge wouldn't just heal me. It would free her, too. I started small. Old contacts. People who had gone silent after my fall. One by one, I reached out. Some hung up immediately. Some cursed me. But a few listened. One man, a junior accountant back then, admitted he'd seen inconsistencies but had been threatened into silence. Another, a secretary, remembered shredding documents at unusual hours, names she was told never to mention again. Each conversation was a spark. Each spark lit the map brighter. I traced payments. I followed property records. I dug into offshore accounts I'd once been praised for spotting in other firms. It was almost poetic. The skills they had tried to bury were the very tools I now used to dig their graves. And through it all, my daughter fed me more. Passwords overheard. Conversations caught in passing. Bits of gossip from her new in-laws who assumed she was nothing more than a bride, smiling and oblivious. But she wasn't oblivious anymore. She was my partner. There were nights when I faltered. Nights when the weight of it all pressed so heavy I thought about throwing the drive into the river, pretending none of it mattered. But then I'd remember. The laughter at that dinner table. My wife's sneer when she told me I'd never be trusted again. The way my daughter once looked at me with disgust, believing the lies. And I knew, some debts cannot go unpaid. This wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It was about balance. About restoring something they had stolen. Not just my reputation, but the dignity of a man who had been stripped of everything. And so I worked. Patiently. Quietly. Each piece of evidence collected. Each witness found. Each paper trail documented. A web of truth, strong enough to strangle. 3 months after the wedding, I had enough. A binder thick with documents. Transcripts of calls. Signed statements from those once silenced. I laid it out on my table one night, staring at it like a general reviewing his battle plans. My daughter sat across from me, her face pale but resolute. "Are we really going to do this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She exhaled slowly, then whispered, "Good." Her smile was faint, trembling at the edges. But it was the smile of a daughter who, at last, believed in her father again. I leaned back, closing my eyes. For years, they thought they had buried me. But the thing about burying the truth is that roots keep growing underground. And now those roots were ready to crack through the surface, to split stone, to tear down walls. It was time. Not for justice. Not for forgiveness. For ruin. The night of their anniversary felt unreal, as though I were walking back into a dream I'd already lived a dozen times in my head. The hotel was the same brand of opulence as the wedding. Chandeliers dripping with crystal, carpets too plush to feel honest, champagne already flowing like rivers. I arrived early, standing in the lobby longer than I needed to, watching people stream past in gowns and tuxedos, laughing, shaking hands. These were the circles I had once belonged to. Now I was tolerated only because my daughter insisted. Good. Let them see me as weak, pitiful. Let them see the man they thought they'd buried. They would never suspect that tonight I was holding the shovel. The flash drive had become something more than a tool. It was a weapon. I'd spent weeks layering its contents into a presentation that even the boldest liar couldn't spin away from. Screenshots, voice recordings, notarized testimony, truth sharpened into blades. But the most dangerous part wasn't the data. It was the timing. My daughter had done her part perfectly. The AV technician thought he was loading a simple anniversary slideshow. Family photos, vacations, images of their sprawling estates. Harmless, polished. He didn't know that file was just the opening act. At the exact cue, when the crowd's attention was at its height, the program would switch. And the truth would roll across the screen, unstoppable. I found a seat near the back, invisible. A ghost among the living. They filed in. My ex-wife in a gown that screamed wealth. Her brother in a suit too sharp for his soul. My daughter sat stiff beside her husband, who grinned and slapped shoulders as if he owned the room. I caught her eyes once. She didn't smile, didn't nod, but she didn't look away either. That was enough. The evening unfolded as expected. Toasts, laughter, carefully staged nostalgia. Uncle Paul stood first. His voice boomed with false warmth. "Family," he declared, "is the bedrock of everything we've built." I nearly choked on the irony. Family was his weapon. Family was his shield. Then my ex-wife took the stage. Still beautiful, still poised. Her voice honeyed as she spoke of sacrifice and resilience. She glanced at me once, just long enough to let me know I was still the butt of her private joke. I held her gaze and smiled. She didn't like that. The room darkened for the slideshow. Guests turned their attention to the screen, expecting a parade of carefully chosen images. And for the first 2 minutes, that's exactly what they got. childhood photos, vacations, smiling faces, safe. Then, seamlessly, the shift began. A scanned contract appeared. My signature at the bottom. Gasps rippled faintly. To most, it looked ordinary. But the trained eyes in the crowd, lawyers, bankers, executives, saw the problem immediately. The font mismatch. The date misaligned. A forgery, plain as day. The next slide showed another. And another. Whispers filled the hall. Then came the emails. Projected larger than life, black letters against a white background. If this works, we won't have to worry about him standing in the way anymore. My ex-wife's name. Her brother's address. My boss's seat. Silence fell like a stone. And then the room exploded. What is this? My ex-wife shrieked, surging to her feet. Her voice cracked, high and ugly. Turn it off. This is slander. This is. Her brother leapt up, face red, fists clenched. Lies. Manufactured lies. I rose slowly from my seat, binder in hand. The crowd parted as I walked forward. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. Every eye followed me. These, I said, my voice calm, carrying over the noise, are not lies. They are the truth you buried. The proof you hoped would rot unseen. I opened the binder, flipping it onto the head table. Documents slid across the white linen. Bank records. Notarized statements. Hard evidence. You framed me, I said, staring straight at my ex-wife. You destroyed my name, my career, my family. And you laughed while I drowned. Gasps echoed. Someone in the crowd whispered, my God. Her brother's face twisted. This is defamation. Do you know who you're accusing? Yes, I said evenly. And so does everyone else now. It was then my daughter stood. For a heartbeat, I feared she might collapse under the weight of it all. But her voice rang steady as she took the microphone. I found the files, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. My father didn't destroy anything. They did. Every document you see tonight, I copied myself. I saw the messages. I heard the calls. He was innocent. They made him a scapegoat. The hall fell silent again. People who had once sneered at me now stared at her, then at me, their faces shifting with dawning realization. I know the truth, she said again, louder this time. And now you all do too. The aftermath was chaos. Reporters who had been invited for the anniversary swarmed with questions. Phones lit up as guests texted contacts, recorded video, captured evidence. My ex-wife fled the stage, her brother in tow, both hounded by whispers. Her once pristine mask cracked into something jagged, ugly. Within days, investigations were launched. Lawyers circled like vultures. Accounts froze. Partnerships dissolved. The empire they had built on lies began to crumble, stone by stone. I didn't celebrate. Revenge isn't champagne and fireworks. It's quieter, heavier. Weeks later, I sat again at my kitchen table, this time with my daughter across from me. The binder was gone, now in the hands of investigators. The room was lit only by a single lamp. I'm sorry, she whispered, her hand trembling around her teacup. For believing them. For hating you. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. You came back when it mattered. Tears welled in her eyes. Do you forgive me? There's nothing to forgive, I said. And for once, I meant it. Revenge didn't erase the years they stole from me. It didn't restore my career or return the man I once was. But it gave me something better. It gave me my daughter back. It gave me silence, not the silence of shame, but the silence of peace. And as I sat with her, the world outside still buzzing with the ruins of our enemies, I finally understood. They had buried me alive. But the thing about graves is, sometimes the dead crawl back. And when they do, they don't come begging. They come to collect. If you've made this far, thank you for watching, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.